They told me my land was worthless, and my son said it with the kind of casual cruelty a man uses when he thinks age has made you too soft to protest. Mom, memories. That sentence still sits in my bones like a cold stone, the kind that never warms, no matter how many summers pass. I am 82 now, and I live alone in a house that has outlasted 2 wars, 1 marriage, a miscarriage, and the slow, thin unraveling of the family I thought I had. The walls lean a little when the wind shakes them, but they stand, just like I do, stubborn and rattling, but somehow intact. When I wake up in the small hours, which happens more often than not, I walk to the window, pressing my hand against the glass to steady myself, and look out toward the strip of land that used to be mine. Even now, after everything that's happened, I can't quite accept that it legally belongs to someone else, that a field I once walked barefoot through on July mornings is no longer an extension of my life. It still feels like a limb that someone tried to cut off without anesthetic, and even though the limb is gone, the pain insists on staying. It wasn't always like this. There was a time, long ago, when my son used to run across that same field in shoes too big for him, the ones he begged for because real farmers wear boots like these, Mom. And I bought them, even though they blistered his heels. He dragged sticks through the dirt, chased grasshoppers, and carved his initials into the old oak stump on the west side. Back then, he treated the land with a child's reverence, as if it held secrets only he could discover. Sometimes I think he forgot all those mornings when he pressed his small palm into the soil to help me plant beans, or those evenings when he sat beside me on the fence, leaning against my arm because he was too tired to keep his head up. I held on to those memories as if they were proof that he wouldn't drift too far from himself, or from me. But time has a ruthless habit of erasing the parts of us we don't visit often enough. As for the land itself, 20 acres of stubborn, rocky, uneven soil, no one but me ever thought it was worth anything. It's true, it never gave us much in the way of crops, but it gave us something else, something quieter and far more durable. It gave us belonging. At least that's what my father said the year he handed it to me, the deed still warm from his coat pocket. "Take care of this place," he told me. "And it'll take care of you. Maybe not in the ways you expect, but in the ways that matter." I believed him because he was the kind of man who spoke only when he meant every word. Now, decades later, I still feel him in that soil, in the dusty scent that rises when the wind kicks up, in the way the ground seems to hold its breath before the first snowfall of winter. My son doesn't remember any of that. No, that's not true. He remembers. He just doesn't value it. Modern life taught him to measure worth by immediate results, by market value, by whatever number someone with a polished smile in a document folder says out loud. He told me more than once that sentimentality is a liability, as though love were some kind of fungus that ruins clean surfaces. He started talking like that after he married, though I won't pretend the blame rests entirely on his wife's shoulders. Marriage doesn't invent a man, it reveals him. The first time he called the land an old woman's burden, I laughed, thinking he was joking. But when he didn't laugh back, when he just stared at me with mild impatience, as if waiting for me to accept a truth he believed I'd avoided long enough, something inside me tightened. A thread pulled taut. I brushed it aside then, because mothers are so good at making excuses for the sons they love. We think we can soften the hard edges in them by simply refusing to see them. That day he brought the papers, thick, folded, and smelling of toner. I didn't suspect anything. He said I should have sensed the shift in his voice, how it hovered just above condescension like a poorly balanced glass. I should have noticed the way he avoided eye contact, the way he tapped the pen against the table as if impatient for me to cooperate. But I didn't. I held the pen between my fingers, my knuckles aching, and signed. The moment the ink touched the paper, he let out a breath, quiet, relieved, guilty. And that's when the air changed. That's when something in me understood, even if I couldn't yet shape it into language. I had just given him something he didn't deserve. When I found out the truth, weeks later, not from him, but from the sound of machinery growling across the field, I didn't scream. I didn't faint or clutch my heart or beg someone to explain. Only later, when I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table, did the betrayal settle over me fully, like dust over a forgotten shelf. I didn't cry. There's an age at which tears feel like a luxury we can no longer afford. Instead, I sat very still, listening to the machines outside, their metal arms dragging through the soil as if trying to erase my entire life, one scoop at a time. I wish I could tell you, I marched into my son's house that very day, demanded answers, demanded respect, demanded justice. But the truth is quieter and far more humiliating. I waited for him to come to me. I told myself he would explain everything, that he would apologize, that he had reasons. I sat in my chair by the window for 2 days, the phone on the table beside me, watching the road for his car. When he finally arrived, he didn't look ashamed. He looked irritated, as if my shock were an inconvenience he hadn't planned for. "Mom, please don't make this dramatic," he said, stepping into the kitchen as though he owned the house too. "It's done. You didn't need that land. I took care of it." The world tilted then, not because I was dizzy, but because the floor underneath the relationship we'd built for decades shifted and cracked. I am telling you all this because the story doesn't start with the discovery under the ground or with the buyer's frantic phone call last month that woke my son in the night. No, the story begins here, in this wound, in this slow fracture between mother and son, in the quiet house where I now spend most evenings listening to the wind cross an empty field that used to be mine. And as I watch the shadows of the oak trees stretch across the ground, reaching toward a land I no longer own, I think to myself, perhaps some things buried beneath the surface were never meant to stay hidden. Perhaps that includes the truth, his and mine. I found out the truth on a Tuesday morning that began like all the others. Quiet light creeping through the curtains, the kettle humming its thin old man whistle, the world moving in its usual careful rhythm. Nothing in the air suggested that my life had already been rearranged behind my back. Nothing whispered the warning that I was about to walk into a truth sharp enough to slice through the last illusions I still held about my son. I stepped outside with my cup of tea, cradling it between my palms the way I always do when I need warmth not just around me, but inside my hands, inside my bones, inside the parts of me that had begun to feel brittle with age. I remember thinking the morning felt unusually still, almost like the land itself was holding its breath, and I should have known that such stillness often precedes a storm. But the mind protects itself with small blindfolds when it doesn't want to see what's right in front of it. It wasn't until I heard the low mechanical groaning, that grinding animal sound of metal tearing into soil, that something inside me tightened. At first, I thought one of the neighbors had finally decided to level a patch of their property, because everyone around here likes to reinvent their little corner of the world every few years, tearing down and rebuilding as if constant improvement were a moral requirement. But when I walked toward the fence line, the sound grew louder, closer, wrong. I saw the machine's yellow arm rising and falling like a monstrous limb, digging deep trenches right into the center of my field. My field. A truck I didn't recognize was parked near the lower slope, and two men in bright vests were walking back and forth with clipboards, talking to each other like they were discussing specifications for a job everyone had agreed on. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing, because the mind, when shocked, reaches first for the explanations that make the least sense. I remember telling myself they must be lost, or confused, or working for the county on some utility project, though I knew perfectly well no such plans had ever been announced. I stood there, gripping the fence rail, my knuckles whitening as if trying to hold the world steady. One of the men spotted me and waved with a politeness that pierced me deeper than rudeness would have. He jogged over to the fence, his boots thudding against the dirt, and smiled the kind of smile people use when they think they're about to deliver news that won't matter much. "Morning, ma'am," he called out. "Just letting you know we're starting the first phase today. Shouldn't take long." I stared at him, trying to piece together his meaning. My voice came out smaller than I intended, thin like a frayed thread. "The first phase of what?" The man blinked, confused, and consulted the papers on his clipboard. "The excavation work, for the new owner." "Didn't they tell you?" The world dimmed around the edges then, not dramatically, not like in films where everything goes blurry. It was quieter than that, as if someone had slowly turned down the volume on the universe. I felt my heartbeat in my throat, steady but heavy, each thud a cold reminder that I was still awake, still alive, still present in a moment I had not been warned would come. "The new owner," I repeated, and he must have sensed something in my voice, because the smile slipped off his face like a loose button, and his expression tightened with uneasy sympathy. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said carefully, "but the sale went through last month. We've got all the permits. Everything's cleared. We assumed you already knew." I didn't answer him because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't shatter me further. I turned away from the fence slowly, each step deliberate, as though the earth beneath me were suddenly unfamiliar terrain. I walked back to the house without looking behind me, but the sound of the machine followed, that awful, grinding, ripping sound, the sound of something precious being taken apart, piece by piece. Inside, the kitchen felt colder than usual, too bright, the sunlight catching on the edges of the countertop in a way that made the room feel brittle. I set my tea down, though I don't remember doing it, and sank into the chair by the window where I used to shell peas with my mother. There are moments in life that arrive not with thunder, but with a quiet, surgical precision, carving through everything you thought you knew. This was one of them. I walked to the drawer where I keep my old files, the deed, the tax statements, the letters from my father, all the little proofs of a life lived with care and memory, and pulled out the folder that had always made me feel grounded, secure, tethered to something solid. When I opened it, the absence hit me before the realization did. The deed was gone. The folder felt lighter, wrong, a hollow version of itself. The air left my lungs so quickly I had to sit down again. And in that moment, I remembered the day my son had brought me those papers, the way he guided my hand toward the page, the ink sliding across the line where my name should be, the strange heaviness in the room afterward. Some truths hit slowly, dripping into the mind like cold water, but this one poured in all at once, flooding me with a clarity I never asked for. He hadn't needed my signature for taxes. He had needed it to transfer ownership, quietly, efficiently, without the burden of a conversation. He had sold the land, my land, his childhood, our history, for $40,000. A sum so small it felt like an insult, a casual dismissal of everything that soil had ever held. I sat in silence, listening to the machines in the distance, their digging steady, greedy, uncaring. He knew what that land meant to me. He knew, and betrayal at 82 doesn't feel like it does at 20 or 40 or even 60. It doesn't ignite anger first. It hollows you. It scoops out the center of you like a spoon carving into fruit that's overripe, until all that's left is a soft collapse where your trust used to live. I thought of calling him, demanding an explanation, insisting he come home immediately, but the truth was already there, sitting across from me like an uninvited guest who intended to stay. He didn't accidentally forget to tell me. He deliberately chose not to. He had waited until the deal was done, until the ink was dry, until the machines were already in position, so that nothing, even my disbelief, could undo what he had taken. The real shock wasn't the loss of the land. It was the realization that my son believed I wouldn't fight him, that I would simply accept whatever scraps of explanation he decided were sufficient. He counted on my silence, my softness, my age. He counted on the version of me he carried in his head, a woman shrinking, fading, too tired to resist. But what he never understood is that the older you get, the fewer illusions you have left, and the few that remain you guard fiercely. My father's land was one of them, and though I didn't know it yet, though I sat there stunned and motionless while the machines tore into the earth, something deep inside me began to shift, slowly, quietly, like old ground cracking open beneath the weight of long-buried truth. I felt the days stretch into one another after the excavation began, each one longer and heavier than the last, as if time itself were thickening around me, slowing my steps and sharpening my thoughts in ways I hadn't expected. Grief doesn't always shout. Sometimes it settles like dust on everything you touch, turning even the simplest actions into reminders of what you've lost. I woke earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because sleep had become the one place I didn't want to linger. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the rumbling of the backhoe, the tearing of soil, the mechanical grunts that carried a kind of violence no one else seemed to notice. I told myself I'd walk down to the field and speak to the workers, ask them for clarification, demand at least a shred of respect. But every time I reached the porch and saw the machines clawing deeper into land I no longer owned, courage slipped. From me, like steam escaping a kettle. The first time my son showed up after the sale, he didn't knock. He never had to knock in the past, so I suppose it made sense that he didn't think twice about it. But something about the way he entered, casual, loud, as if walking into the home of a woman who owed him comfort, made something inside me twist. He carried the scent of aftershave and impatience with him, and when he said my name, it wasn't soft or worried or apologetic. It was clipped, functional, as if he were addressing someone who had inconvenienced him. I watched him from the kitchen table, my cup of tea growing cold in front of me, and I wondered when the space between us had widened into something unrecognizable. He told me the sale was done now, finalized, nothing left to fuss over. And when I didn't answer, he sighed through his nose like I was being unreasonable. He assured me the money would be useful, that he had placed it in an account for my long-term care, and the phrase struck me with such force I had to look away. Long-term care. As if I were already gone. as if my life was something to be managed rather than lived. In the days that followed, the machines dug deeper, and so did my son's indifference. He stopped trying to mask his irritation. Every call I didn't answer turned into a message about how I needed to move on, how dwelling on the past would only make things harder. Harder for whom? He never specified. I found myself lingering at the window each afternoon, watching him park by the field and approach the workers with a swagger that didn't belong to the boy who once cried when his kite tore on the same soil that now trembled under heavy machinery. He spoke to them with quick gestures, pointing at survey flags, crossing his arms, tapping his foot, complaining about delays. It was clear he wanted the excavation to move faster, but I couldn't understand why. What was the urgency? What was he so desperate to accomplish? The buyer, Mr. Lawson, though he insisted I call him John, was another kind of presence entirely. He came to speak with me one evening, his hat in his hands, his boots still dusty from the field. He was polite in a way that felt old-fashioned, the kind of politeness that carries both respect and caution, and when he asked whether I had truly known nothing about the sale, there was no judgment in his voice, only bewilderment. I invited him inside because it felt rude not to, but as he stood in my kitchen, glancing around at the familiar clutter of my life, I saw a flicker of discomfort in his eyes, like he realized he was standing in the home of someone who had been wronged in a way he couldn't undo. He tried to reassure me, to tell me that he had paid a fair price for the land based on what he had been told, that he had no intention of causing harm, but the words felt small compared to the weight I carried. He mentioned the digging was necessary for his project, though he avoided describing exactly what that project entailed, and something about that avoidance lodged itself in my mind. After he left, I walked through the house, touching things I hadn't touched in years. Photographs, old recipe cards, the worn handle of my father's shovel leaning in the corner. I found myself reaching into cabinets as though searching for a version of the past I could hold on to, some proof that I had not imagined the meaning the land once had. The more the workers dug into the earth, the emptier the house began to feel, as if the loss of the land were somehow hollowing out everything around it. Nights were the worst. The machines stopped at dusk, but the echo of their engines lingered in my ears. I would sit in my chair by the window, the same chair where I used to peel apples while my husband read the paper, and stare into the darkness, waiting for something. Clarity, anger, a plan to arrive. But nothing came, only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the slow sinking of my heart. The first escalation wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't a confrontation or a revelation. It was a shift in atmosphere, subtle and insidious. The unease grew in small increments. The ground seemed to tremble more each day, not because of the machinery, but because of what the digging represented. A loss not merely of property, but of identity. My son's visits became more frequent, but less meaningful. He came not to check on me, but to check on the excavation, barely glancing my way as he strode across the yard. He mumbled half-hearted greetings, asked if I needed anything, then rushed outside before I could answer. The hollowness of those interactions filled me with a quiet, simmering ache. I tried to confront him once, if confrontation is even the right word for the way I spoke, gently, cautiously, as if trying not to spook a dangerous animal. I stood in the doorway and asked him why he hadn't told me the truth, why he had taken something from me under the guise of helping. He didn't look up from his phone when he answered. He said I was overreacting, that the land had been dead weight, that he had handled it like an adult, and if I couldn't appreciate that, then maybe it was time for me to face reality. I felt the words land inside me like stones thrown into still water, each one creating a ripple that left me more unsteady. From that point on, every little thing felt like a reminder of what he had done. The mailman handing me letters addressed to my late husband, the sight of my old boots by the back door, the smell of rain-soaked earth after a storm. Each moment deepened the sense that something essential had been torn from me and that the tear was widening, not healing. I found myself talking aloud to the empty house, telling memories as if they were people who could answer back. I traced the lines of my father's handwriting on an old letter and wondered what he would say if he saw how easily the land had been signed away. The quiet cruelty of the situation wasn't in the fact that the land was gone. It was in the days afterward, in the way the world kept moving as if nothing had happened, in the way my son acted as though I should be grateful, in the way each sunrise illuminated a landscape that no longer felt like mine. The boundaries of my life were shrinking, not physically, but emotionally. And though I didn't know it then, this slow, steady diminishment was preparing me for the breaking point that would come later, when the digging unearths something none of us expected, something that would force my son to confront the truth he had tried so hard to bury. I didn't notice the moment the shift began, not because it was subtle, but because I had been living for weeks in a haze thick enough to blur anything that didn't wound me directly. But one afternoon, when the machines had paused for lunch and the land lay strangely still, I felt something in myself tilt, a slow internal turning, like a heavy door swinging on old hinges, stubborn at first, then undeniably moving. It started with a sound, soft, metallic, out of place amid the familiar clatter of excavation. I was sitting by the window, staring out at the scarred field, when I heard the men shout to each other, their voices carrying a tone I hadn't heard before. It wasn't frustration, and it wasn't the easy chatter of men doing routine work. It was something sharper, more electric, as if they had stumbled onto a truth bigger than the job they'd been hired for. I leaned closer to the glass, holding my breath without meaning to, and watched as a small group gathered near the eastern trench. One of them crouched down, brushing away dirt with a carefulness that seemed almost reverent. Curiosity tugged at me, a feeling I hadn't experienced since the sale. For weeks I'd avoided stepping foot on the property, not because I lacked the will, but because the idea of witnessing the land in its wounded state felt like a second betrayal. Yet something about the worker's posture, alert, uncertain, expectant, pulled me outside. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, even though the afternoon was warm, and walked slowly across the yard, my shoes sinking slightly into the damp soil. As I approached the fence, one of the younger workers noticed me and hesitated, his face caught between wanting to explain and fearing he shouldn't. Before he could decide, the foreman, a broad-shouldered man with a graying beard, stepped toward me with measured strides. His expression was serious, not unfriendly, but cautious. The way people look when they know the truth they're holding might bruise the listener. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his cap out of habit, "you might want to see this." The invitation startled me. No one had offered me anything since the land changed hands, least of all access to the very earth that had been taken from me. I stepped through the open gate he gestured toward, my heart beating with a mixture of dread and something I hadn't felt in a long time. Authority, thin and fragile, but present. When I reached the trench, the workers parted, creating space for me. And there, half buried in the dirt, was an object I couldn't immediately identify. It looked at first like a metal container, but not like any agricultural equipment I'd ever used. Its edges were too sharp, too precise, its surface too smooth beneath the layers of earth, as if it had been crafted with deliberate intention rather than the rough practicality of farm tools. The foreman cleared his throat. A faint chill rose through my fingertips, a sensation that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with recognition. Recognition not of the object itself, but of the feeling it stirred, the sense that the land had been holding onto. Something long before any of us knew to look. When I stood again, the workers watched me with a strange mix of curiosity and respect. One of them held out a folded piece of paper they had found wedged between two stones deeper in the trench. The writing was faded, the edges worn, but I would know that handwriting anywhere. My father's. My vision blurred as I unfolded the fragile note. The words were short, hurried, heavy with secrecy. For safekeeping, not to be moved without consent. For the family's protection. The date beneath it placed the note decades before I was even born. My throat tightened, not with grief, but with an old dormant strength, rising slowly like a stubborn tide. I felt the weight of my father's intentions settling into my hands, grounding me in a way nothing had in weeks. The land hadn't just been sentimental, it had been purposeful, chosen, guarded, and my son, in his rush to discard what he couldn't immediately quantify, had sold something far more valuable than he could comprehend. Standing there, the machines silent around us and the workers waiting for some signal I didn't know how to give, I felt a shift unravel inside me. It wasn't anger. Anger is loud and hot and tries to escape through the skin. No, this was cooler, steadier, a quiet clarity that didn't need to shout to be heard. I realized for the first time since the betrayal that I was not powerless. The sale was not the period at the end of the sentence. It was merely a comma, a pause before a revelation neither my son nor I had expected. I folded my father's note with careful fingers, feeling the tremor of history pulsing through the fragile paper, and placed it inside the pocket of my shawl. As I did, something remarkable happened. My back straightened, my breath deepened, and I felt the faint but undeniable resurgence of the woman I used to be, the one who could hold her ground even when the world tried to shift beneath her feet. When I returned to the house, the air inside felt different, as though the walls themselves had inhaled alongside me. I laid the note on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time, letting the implications settle like dust after a storm. I thought about my father's cryptic words, about the containers buried deep in the soil, about the way the workers had looked at me as if recognizing my connection to something they didn't yet understand. And for the first time since the machines had arrived, I felt something other than loss. I felt purpose, sharp, awakening, insistent. The land had not been done speaking, and neither was I. The days after they uncovered my father's note formed a strange kind of hinge in my life. Everything that came before tilted back into place with new meaning, and everything that followed began, quietly but decisively, to move in another direction. For a few brief hours I allowed myself to sit with the revelation, like a woman sitting with an old friend, feeling the weight of it, running my fingers along its edges, trying to understand what it demanded of me. But the world and my son did not intend to give me much time. News of the discovery spread faster than decency should allow. By the next morning, a different kind of vehicle arrived at the edge of the field. Not the worn trucks of hired laborers, but government cars with discreet markings, the kind that announce authority without needing to raise their voice. Two men and a woman in crisp shirts and sensible shoes walked the perimeter with clipboards and small cameras, talking in low tones to the foreman, occasionally glancing towards the house as if measuring how much trouble I might cause if I decided to. Raise my head, I watched them from the kitchen window at first, feeling that old instinct to stay small, to keep out of the way, to be reasonable in the way aging women are expected to be, grateful for any explanation offered, careful not to inconvenience anyone, with too many questions. But every time I touched the pocket where my father's note rested, that instinct met resistance, as though he were pressing his hand gently against my back, encouraging me to stand up straighter, to remember whose name had been on the deed all those years before my son learned how to spell his own. Sometime after noon, the phone rang, sharp and insistent, cutting through the hum of my thoughts. I knew who it was before I picked up. There is a way your child's anxiety travels through wires that no technology can disguise. "Mom," he said without preamble, his voice already tight. "We need to talk about what they're finding out there." He didn't ask if I was all right, or if anyone had spoken to me, or even whether I knew that strangers were now picking through the buried secrets of my family's land. It was clear from the way he spoke that my awareness of the situation was the least important part of the equation for him. I could hear movement behind him, the faint beep of a car door, the murmur of someone else's voice, and then the muffled thump of another door closing. He had driven out here without telling me, which I suppose would have felt like concern years ago, but now registered only as urgency of a different, more self-interested sort. When he walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, he didn't look like the boy who used to track mud onto the linoleum. He looked like a man cornered, his jaw rigid, his eyes unfocused in the way people's eyes get when they are already 3. Conversations ahead in their minds. He didn't sit down. He paced once, then twice, then leaned against the counter as if bracing for some physical impact. "They called me," he said. "Lawson and those inspector people. They said there's historical material buried in the field. Some kind of old military stuff. They're talking about federal ownership, about chain of custody, about liability. They asked who knew what and when." The words spilled out of him in a rush, too fast, too packed with terms he barely understood. I listened, letting the clipped phrases stack themselves between us like a wall. Liability, inspection, chain of custody. "You didn't tell them anything, did you?" he asked suddenly, his eyes snapping to mine, searching for guilt where there was none. "About the note, I mean. That stupid little scrap of paper the workers found." I felt my father bristle inside my chest at the word stupid, but I kept my voice even. I told him I had the note, that I had read it, that it was not stupid, and that it clearly stated the buried items were not to be moved without the consent of the family. I watched the color drain slightly from his face as the legal implications sorted themselves in his head. "Mom, listen to me," he said, switching to the tone he used when he wanted to sound patient, while actually being anything but. "We need to present a united front here. You can't go waving around some old scrap of paper and confusing people. These are professionals. They don't care about sentimental stories. We just need to confirm that everything about the sale was above board, that you knew and consented. That's all. Then they'll figure out who owns whatever's down there, and we can all move on." It took me a moment to understand what he was truly asking. He wasn't protecting me. He was recruiting me for his version of events, for his safety. Quietly, almost gently, he was asking me to lie on his behalf, to say I had known about the sale from the beginning, that I had willingly given up the land, that any decisions he made afterward were made with my blessing. He was asking me to erase my own betrayal, so that he could present himself as a dutiful son who had handled things like an adult. The realization settled over me like a slow, cold rain. I saw, in that moment, not just the man standing in my kitchen, but the pattern of him across the years, the small deflections, the half-truths, the convenient omissions whenever honesty might complicate his comfort. "I won't say that," I told him, my voice quiet but firm, and the stillness that followed was almost physical. He blinked as if he hadn't heard me correctly, then let out a short, humorless laugh. "Mom, don't be dramatic. It's just a formality. Everyone does this. You're overthinking it. You signed the papers, didn't you? You got the money. You're not homeless. Why does it matter what exact words we use now? It's all the same thing." I realized then that he truly believed that. That to him, the details of consent and truth and respect were just semantic inconveniences, dust on the surface of a transaction. I felt a slow heat rise in my chest, not the wild burn of rage, but a steady, contained warmth like coals finally catching after smoldering for a long time. "What matters," I said, choosing each word as carefully as if I were placing stones across a river, "is that you took something that wasn't yours to take, and you did it behind my back. What matters is that now that something important has been found, you're afraid of what that says about you. And what matters most is that you're asking me to help you pretend the betrayal never happened." He flinched, a quick, involuntary movement, and for a fleeting second, I saw the boy in him again, the one who used to look at me with wide, wounded eyes. When he thought he'd disappointed me, but the moment passed as quickly as it came, his face hardened and his shoulders straightened defensively. "You're twisting this," he snapped. "You always do this. You make things bigger than they are. I did what had to be done. That land was wasting away. You're old, Mom. You can't manage it. I secured your future. And now, because some metal boxes show up, you want to act like I robbed you. Do you hear yourself?" His words came faster, sharper, each sentence a small blade trying to cut through my resolve. Years ago, they might have. I spent so much of my life second-guessing my own perceptions, smoothing my own edges to avoid making my loved ones uncomfortable, convincing myself that maybe I was too sensitive, too attached, too unreasonable. But something about holding my father's note in my pocket, something about knowing that he had entrusted that land to me with intention and trust, made it impossible to swallow the lie this time. Outside, one of the government inspectors began walking toward the house, her steps measured and confident, a clipboard tucked under her arm. My son saw her through the window and swore under his breath. "Just remember what we talked about," he hissed. "You knew. You agreed. We're all on the same page, right?" I looked at him then, really looked, letting the silence between us stretch into something undeniable. "No," I said simply. "We are not on the same page." His jaw worked as if he were chewing on anger he couldn't quite swallow. Before he could respond, the inspector knocked on the door, a polite little tap that sounded absurdly delicate given the heaviness of the moment. The woman introduced herself in the calm, clipped tone of someone used to dealing with complicated situations. She explained that the objects they had found appeared to be from a defunct government program, possibly dating back to my father's time, and that there were questions about rightful possession and legal responsibility. She asked if I had known about any of this before the excavation began. I thought of my son standing beside me, nearly vibrating with tension, and felt his unspoken plea hanging in the air like a fog. This was the moment he had been trying to control. This was the moment he wanted me to erase myself in favor of his safety. I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and insistent, as I answered. "No," I said slowly, clearly, each syllable a quiet act of defiance. I did not know what was buried there. I did not authorize the sale of that land in the way it was carried out. I was told I was signing tax papers, not transfer of ownership. My consent was not informed. The inspector's eyes flicked from my face to my son's, then back again, and she nodded once, jotting something down. My son exhaled sharply, a sound half disbelief, half fury, but he didn't interrupt. The woman asked if there were any records, letters, documents, anything from my father that might support what I was saying. Wordlessly, I walked to the table, picked up the folded note, and handed it to her. She read it carefully, her brow furrowing, and I watched her expression shift almost imperceptibly, a sign that the words carried weight beyond sentiment. After she left, promising that legal counsel would be in touch and that the situation was more complex than initially assumed, my son turned on me with a look I had never seen on his face before. It wasn't just anger. It was disbelief that I had chosen myself over him. "You don't know what you've just done," he said, his voice low and shaking. "They're going to investigate now. They're going to look at the paperwork, at the signatures, at everything. Do you have any idea what that means for me? For my job? For my reputation?" I felt tired then, but not in the way that makes you want to lie down. It was the kind of tired that comes from finally stepping out of a role you've been playing for too long. "It means," I replied, "that the truth will have to stand on its own feet. Just like you." He stared at me, and for a moment I thought he might shout, or throw something, or storm out and slam the door like he did when he was 17 and didn't get his way. Instead, his shoulders slumped, and something in his face collapsed. "I can't sleep," he admitted suddenly, the words tumbling out as if he hadn't meant to say them. Ever since Lawson called about those boxes, I wake up at 3 a.m, my heart pounding, thinking about signatures and bank transfers and what people will say if they find out. I dream that the land is swallowing me whole. Does that make you happy? Is that what you wanted? There it was. The confession nestled inside accusation, the plea for absolution dressed as blame. For a brief second, my heart clenched, old instincts stirring, the ones that had always rushed to soothe, to reassure, to protect him from consequences. But then I thought of my own sleepless nights, of the sound of metal tearing through soil, of the moment I realized he had turned me into a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be honored, and the pity softened into something else. "No," I said, my voice gentler now, but no less firm. "I don't want you to suffer. I never have. But I won't suffer in silence so you can be comfortable. Not anymore." That was the second escalation, though neither of us called it that. It was the moment when the quiet, private betrayal cracked open into something public, something that would invite scrutiny and consequence, something that would force my son to face more than just his own reflection in a polished surface. The land, faithful as ever, had refused to let the past be buried forever, and in doing so, it dragged our present out into the light as well. As the day, he stopped pacing through the kitchen like he owned it, and instead hovered near the doorway, uncertain whether he was still welcome in a house where his version of the story no longer reigned. At night I would sit by the window, listening not just to the quiet of the field, but to the quiet inside myself, a stillness I hadn't known in years. I knew there would be harder conversations ahead, legal meetings, perhaps even courtrooms, and that my decision to stand firm would cost me whatever easy relationship I might still have salvaged with my son. But there was a strange peace in that knowledge, too, because for the first time in a long time, I was not disappearing to make someone else's life simpler. I was occupying my own life fully, even as it trembled, somewhere beneath the torn-up ground, beneath the metal containers and my father's faded words. The roots of that old land still held fast. And for the first time, I felt myself holding with them. I knew the moment had finally come when the officials returned with a different kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't emerge from uncertainty, but from decision. It was a still morning, the sort where the light falls in long, deliberate shapes across the floor, and the air feels heavy with something waiting to happen. I had been sitting at the kitchen table with my father's note open beside me, the paper soft and fragile from the number of times I'd unfolded it, when a car pulled into the yard. Not one of the modest government sedans or Lawson's contractor trucks, but a darker vehicle with tinted windows that reflected the sky like polished stone. 2 men stepped out, dressed plainly, but with that unmistakable posture of people who've come to say something final. They didn't hurry. They approached the house with the steady confidence of those carrying authority and expecting little resistance. I stood before they knocked, smoothing my skirt without meaning to, the way I used to do before opening the door to my husband's business guests. But this time, I felt no desire to impress or appease. I felt only the faint tremor of a long-awaited reckoning rising inside me. The taller man greeted me politely, introducing himself with a name I forgot the moment he said it, because my attention drifted to the folder he was holding. It looked heavy, weighted not with papers but with consequence. He explained, in that careful, measured tone people use when they want to avoid triggering panic, that the investigation into the buried containers had reached a point where ownership needed to be clarified immediately. There were questions of provenance, of legal transfer, of possible federal interest in the contents, and therefore a full review of the land's sale had been ordered. His eyes moved briefly to my father's note on the table and then back to my face, and I understood without him saying it that the paper had been validated, catalogued, taken seriously in a way even I had not dared hope. They needed me to provide a formal statement, one that would become part of the permanent record. I nodded calmly, as if I had been expecting this exact request for years, and gestured for them to sit. But just as I opened my mouth to begin, another sound pierced the moment. The frantic crunch of gravel under tires, the slam of a car door thrown open with more force than necessary. My son stormed across the yard toward the porch, his movements jerky, his breath visible in the cool air. It was the first time in weeks I had seen him without carefully arranged composure. His hair was unkempt, his shirt wrinkled, his movements those of a man unraveling. He burst through the doorway without knocking, ignoring the officials as if they were furniture, and pointed at me with a trembling hand. "Don't sign anything," he demanded, his voice cracking at the edges. "Don't say a word. They're twisting this, Mom. You don't understand what's at stake. You're being used." The officials remained seated, neither defensive nor dismissive, simply watching him with a patience that made his desperation seem even louder. He paced the room like an animal trying to find the one corner that would let him escape his own conscience. "They're trying to pin liability on me," he continued, his voice rising. "They're saying the sale might be invalid, that the signature wasn't fully authorized. They're implying fraud." "Fraud, Mom. Do you know what that means for me? For my job? For everything I've built?" He looked at me then, not with love, not even with anger, but with raw fear, the kind that makes men forget dignity. You have to tell them you knew. You have to. Otherwise, they'll come after me. You don't want that, do you? You don't want to ruin my life. There it was again, that plea disguised as accusation, that assumption that my purpose in life was to cushion his consequences. And then, slowly, I felt the old version of myself, the woman who bent, who softened, who forgave before the apology was offered, quietly step back inside me. In her place rose a steadier presence, shaped by the land that had sustained me, by the truth my father had left buried, by the weeks of silence in which I'd learned to hear my own voice again. I turned to the officials and told them I was ready to give my statement. My son's breath caught, but I didn't look at him. I spoke clearly, describing the day he brought me the papers under false pretenses, the lack of transparency, the absence of any discussion about selling the property. I repeated his own words. "It's just dirt, Mom. Sign it." With the same casual cruelty he had used then, letting the weight of them settle into the room like stones, I explained how I discovered the sale through the sound of machinery on my land, not through any act of honesty. As I spoke, I felt a strange calm spread through me, not triumph, not satisfaction, just the quiet relief of telling the truth out loud after carrying it like a stone in my chest. My son tried to interrupt, tried to correct the record, tried to insist that I had misunderstood, but the officials silenced him with a raised hand. They asked the necessary clarifying questions, then closed the folder with a soft, decisive click. The taller one informed us that due to the circumstances, misrepresentation, lack of informed consent, and the newly uncovered historical significance, the sale would be temporarily suspended pending full legal review. Effectively, the land was no longer considered lawfully transferred. For the moment, it was back under my authority. My son's knees buckled slightly, not enough to make him fall, but enough to make him reach blindly for the counter, as if needing something solid to hold on to. "You can't do this," he whispered, not to them, but to me, as though I had just struck him. "You don't know what this means for me. You're choosing them over your own son." His voice broke on the last word, a crack that revealed a frightened child beneath the man who had tried so hard to appear impenetrable. I stepped closer, not with softness, but with clarity. "I am not choosing them," I said. "I am choosing the truth. And the truth is that you wronged me. You did. And you must face what that means." He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, truly seeing me, not as a woman fading into old age, not as someone easily manipulated, but as someone who held more strength than he had accounted for. The officials thanked me, gathered their materials, and left with the promise that the next steps would be communicated soon. When the door closed behind them, the house fell into a silence so deep it felt like a space being cleared for something new. My son remained standing there, hollow-eyed, breathing hard, staring at the floor as if expecting it to open beneath him. He whispered, "I never thought you'd turn against me." And something in his tone struck me with a bittersweet clarity. "I didn't turn against you," I said quietly. "You walked away from me long before today." He stayed only a few seconds longer, long enough for the enormity of the moment to settle into the lines of his face, and then he left the house without another word. I watched him go, feeling neither relief nor victory, only a deep, grounded steadiness, as if the earth beneath my feet had finally stopped trembling. The climax had not been loud or violent or dramatic in any cinematic way. It had been a woman telling the truth in her own home, reclaiming what was hers not through force but through clarity, through the undeniable authority of a life lived in quiet integrity. And as the car pulled away, leaving the field and the house in a profound stillness, I felt something inside me settle into place with a finality as irrevocable as a door closing. The land, the truth, and the voice I had rediscovered were mine again, and nothing, not even the son I once carried, could take them from me now. The days after my son drove away carried a strange kind of quiet, not the empty silence of abandonment, but the fuller, deeper quiet that settles when a storm has finally exhausted itself. I woke each morning expecting to feel the familiar ache of loss or the sting of betrayal, but instead I found a calmness spreading slowly through me, a steady warmth like water seeping into dry soil after too long without rain. The officials came and went, their voices polite and measured, their questions precise, and though the future of the land was still being shaped by legal processes far larger than me, I felt no fear. I had reclaimed something more important than acreage or ownership. I had reclaimed the truth of what had happened, and in doing so, I had reclaimed myself. The field itself seemed to sense the shift. Even with the trenches still open and the strange metal containers half exposed in the earth, the air around it felt softer, as if the land were exhaling after being held too tightly for too long. I began walking down to the fence each afternoon, leaning on the railing my husband built 40 years ago, and simply watching the light move across the ground. The soil looked wounded but alive, healing in slow circles the way all living things do once the cutting has stopped. Sometimes I imagined my father standing beside me, his hands tucked behind his back, his face creased with that quiet pride he rarely spoke aloud. I wondered what he would have thought of everything that had unfolded, of the boxes he had hidden so carefully, of the secrets he had left for me to find, of the strength he had trusted I would one day need. I touched the note he wrote so long ago, now kept safely between the pages of one of his old books, and felt its presence inside me like a pulse. It reminded me that time doesn't erase meaning, it buries it, waiting for the right hands to uncover it again. My son did not return that week, nor the next, and his absence no longer felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Instead, it felt like space. Necessary, difficult, but honest. I knew he wasn't sleeping. I knew he was wrestling with the consequences of what he'd done, but I also knew those consequences were his to carry now, not mine to soften. I still loved him, of course. Love, once rooted, doesn't vanish just because a storm breaks branches. But I no longer mistook love for surrender. I no longer believed protecting him meant erasing myself. The shift was quiet, but permanent, like a door once closed that will not swing open again without deliberate force. One evening, just as the sky began to turn that soft lavender color that only appears briefly before night, I walked the long path behind the barn. It led to the highest rise on the property, a small hill where the wildflowers grow in clusters, stubborn even in drought. I had avoided that hill since the sale because it hurt too much to stand where I once felt such belonging. But this time, the pull was stronger than the pain. The climb was slow, and I stopped once to rest my hand on a familiar old fence post, its wood worn smooth by years of wind. When I reached the top, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The view stretched wide around me. The field with its open wounds, the line of trees swaying like a curtain of soft voices, the pale outline of the mountains catching the last light. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the entire landscape settle into my chest with a sense of rightness that made my throat tighten. Standing there, surrounded by the place that had shaped me long before my son was born, I realized I no longer needed the land to be legally mine in order for it to belong to me. Its meaning ran deeper than documents or signatures or weak excuses spoken in a kitchen by a man too afraid to face himself. What was mine, truly mine, could not be sold. Not even by someone I once carried in my arms. My memories, my father's trust, my own recovering voice. These were things untouched by greed and untouched by loss. As the sun dipped lower, I whispered something into the wind. Not a prayer exactly, but a small promise to myself that I would not shrink again. Not for anyone. Age may bend the body, but it sharpens the soul. And I felt that sharpening now like a quiet flame. I began walking back toward the house, the fading light casting long shadows behind me. And for the first time in a long while, the shadows felt like companions rather than burdens. Before going inside, I paused at the porch and looked back toward the field one last time. The trench edges were softened by dusk, the metal containers glinting faintly beneath the earth, as if winking in acknowledgement of all that had been revealed. I felt no bitterness toward my son, only a distant, aching hope that one day he might look at me and finally see the person standing before him, not the version he found easiest to ignore. Maybe he will come back. Maybe he won't. But whatever comes, I am steady now. And if another woman like me ever finds herself holding the pieces of a life someone tried to break quietly, I hope she knows this. You are never too old to reclaim your name, never too tired to rise, and never too late to return to the land inside. You that no one, not even your own blood, can take away.